Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. A few housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type in your question. And we'd be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over on Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also ask any questions you may have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you would like to rewatch this tour or watch any other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out our Facebook page to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce our docent Halmerson, who will be presenting Exploring Dutch Art in the 17th Century. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'll turn things over to you, docent Halmerson.
Thank you so much, Renata. It's very important that we really enjoy questions at the end of the talk. So if you do have some questions, we'll stop about 5 minutes to 12, and hopefully we can have a little dialogue going. It's a little hard to do as the lecture progresses, but quite easily accomplished at the end. I just want to have a little disclaimer for a minute. I just came back from 15 days in Belgium. I visited 17 museums. I will just give you a minute or two highlight. I saw everything from video art by Bill Biola in the city of Liège. I watched as the Ghent altarpiece was being worked on by conservators. 100 Years of Surrealism in Brussels, works by Jan van Eyck, Roger van der Weyden, of course, in the beautiful city of Bruges. The reopening of the Komska Museum in Antwerp, which is the major museum that was closed for 11 years. It has everything from 14th century altarpieces to contemporary art. So if you have not spent a lot of time in Belgium, I really encourage you to visit both Holland and Belgium. I have spent a lot of time in Holland, but this trip was pretty much devoted to Belgian art. What we're looking at here is a painting in the Timken Museum by the great Haarlem landscape painter Jacob van Ruisdael. And what we're looking at, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about this painting, but I just want to show you that the city of Haarlem before, sorry, there's a little glitch there. Haarlem before Amsterdam was actually a very important center for art, culture, etc. But it really was Amsterdam that was the central city. But I do need to tell you about the history because really that is extremely important to understanding this area. What we're looking at is a map from the 17th century of the area when Holland and Belgium were the Netherlandish region. Belgium in the south and Holland in the north. So what's happening? Well, in the 15th century, we talked about that last time, we had Brussels where the French Valois kings were set and they were ruling that area before the Valois kings. In the 15th century, we had Charles V from the Holy Roman Empire was kind of controlling it. Then the French came in, and by the end of the 15th century, about 1485, the Spanish Habsburg took over this region, and it was a Catholic region. However, in the early part of the 16th century, 1517 to be exact, Martin Luther nailed the 95 edicts on the church door asking for change. He wanted change, as many other theologians, Catholic theologians, people like Erasmus as a philosopher and theologian, that the church needed some type of change. So there began to be political struggles in the Low Country. The Spanish kings were in control, but the Protestants who evolved from this Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther, John Calvin, Erasmus, began to say, we want to maintain Christianity, but we want to control our own way of believing and viewing. The Protestant really wanted freedom. So by about 1568, a war began that the first war lasted 39 years, but over time from 1568 to 1648, there was an 80 years war and back and forth trying to wrestle control of this area. By 1668, there was the Treaty of Westphalia, and this whole area became completely the North Protestant, and of course, the South Catholic and the Belgian region, the Flemish region. There was a lot of influence from Italian artists, people like Caravaggio and others who the Dutch artists were aware of. And so things like light and realism, which had been important to the Flemish painters, were also very important to the Dutch painters. What really sparks this beautiful evolution of art and culture in Holland in the 17th century is their very, very strong economy. It became the strongest economy in Europe in the 17th century. The Dutch had a great military and navy. They were supporting artists. We had amazing scientific discovery. And along with controlling the seas, they also had amazing commerce. The Dutch used the idea of windmills to create a pre-industrial economic situation. They could use the windmills to create energy for sawmills. The sawmills built boats. The Dutch were great shipbuilders and map makers. They often also harvested peat and things like linen. So if you go back here, this is a linen bleaching field. So they were very industrious. Also, they were Calvinists. They had a strong work ethic and they wanted to promote their culture. I want to point out a rather, let's say, a little controversial idea that needs to be talked about. Many people, when they look at 17th century Dutch art, they will say the golden age. That is not correct, however, for many reasons. Yes, it was a strong, superior culture, very secure, developing science and art and military. However, with the advent of the Dutch East India Trading Company and the Dutch West Indian Trading Company, we had a lot of commerce, Asia, Japan, etc. However, they capitalized on used slavery, they deforested areas. 660,000 men over the course of 150 years died working for these companies. They died of scurvy, they drowned, they were killed. So the golden age is really not that applicable. You might say it's a strong economy, a wonderful developed culture. Was it a golden age? For those reasons, I would say no. So the theme in art, let's move on to looking at one of the paintings. The theme in art is within a hierarchy. So art at this time, there are sort of 5 general categories. We had historical paintings, which could include biblical and allegorical themes. There was landscape, portraiture, still life, and genre paintings, documenting the people of that time. So by the early part of the 17th century, we really have Antwerp no longer being sort of the center of art. It was Bruges in the 15th century, Antwerp in the 16th century, and now with the fleeing of people back and forth across these borders, a lot of Protestants were fleeing this area of Antwerp, and even some of the Catholics, and they went into Amsterdam. Haarlem actually just before Amsterdam, and then Amsterdam. So now we're kind of in the beginning part of the 17th century. Amsterdam is full throttle. There is a lot of industry, as I described, and also a lot of education is being promoted in Holland. The University of Leiden, where Rembrandt studied, was a source of learning, and it catapulted people into more secure financial positions. It's like today we say, well, if you have a college education, you have a more secure future. That was happening in Holland too. We're also going to look at the fact that the first postal service occurs in Amsterdam and the first commodities market. And we're going to talk about the tulip trade, and that will happen a little bit later. But now we need to look at the origins, the beginning of what art looked like. So the great Peter Bruegel the Elder. Peter Bruegel the Elder was born in Breda. Breda was on the border, it's on the border of Holland and Belgium. And he was really, eventually the family was considered a Flemish family. But in the beginning, they kind of did Catholic and Protestant themes, particularly Peter Bruegel. Peter Bruegel came from a dynasty of great artists. His grandmother Anne was one of his teachers. He had famous children, Peter Bruegel the younger, not as skilled as his father, but he did a lot of genre painting. We have Velvet Bruegel or Jan Bruegel, and then Jan Bruegel the younger, Jan Bruegel the elder, and they were great still life painters. So Peter Bruegel was a very influential artist, one of the greatest Northern Renaissance painters. This masterpiece is in the Timken. It's one of my favorites, and it's called The Parable of the Sower from 1557. So we are talking about 17th century Dutch painting, but I have to do a little prelude and show you sort of the evolution. So Peter Bruegel, as I mentioned, did Catholic and Protestant themes. This happens to be a Protestant theme. And The Parable of the Sower, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what happened is the idea of what we sow, we shall reap. And in the foreground of this Dutch or Flemish town, we have a farmer sowing seeds. And we have this beautiful brushstroke. One thing the Flemish painters did, if you look at the work of Jan van Eyck, for example, Roger van der Vaart, Hans Memling, realism, hyper realism. I mean, you look at the Ghent altarpiece, it's beyond real. The Dutch painters evolved a little softer brushstroke. They wanted to show realism, but they infused it with a little more dynamism, a little more naturalism, and of course, this interest in light. Now, we know that many of these Dutch painters were influenced by the work of Caravaggio in the early part of the 1600s, but later part of the 1500s, early part of the 1600s, but also they did get some inspiration from Jan van Eyck and others. So you see a lot of light here. It's very popular to look at the idea of light. And we have a foreground, as I mentioned, the farmer with a hut, a middle ground where we have probably, peasants, horseback in the middle, and then we have a church, very important to the community, a beautiful river, because one of the reasons why Holland was such a strong economic force was because of its situation on the North Sea. And then we have in the background a town, which could be Breda, his town, but we have Alps. And then we have Jesus proselytizing. So the allegory is what you sow, you shall reap in terms of farming and crop development, but also if you sow the seeds of conversion by proselytizing, you will get more people to believe. And that's the implication here. Here's a little bit of comedy in this. I see this a little bit of humor. Why are there Alps? You have to remember that Holland and Belgium are the Low Countries, and some of it is actually below sea level. There are no Alps, high mountain ranges in either Holland or Belgium. But Peter Bruegel did travel, and he went into the Italian and Alps. He went into Germany, and he worked in Italy with a man named Hieronymus Cook. And Hieronymus Cook was working on a book of parables. So he invited the great Peter Bruegel to come and work with him, and therefore Bruegel had the inspiration of seeing the Alps and wanting to incorporate it in his painting. So if you want to see this magnificent painting, oil on panel, then please do visit the Timken and see one of my favorite all-time images. So we're going to go into the idea of portraiture. Because Holland is now even at this time, before the Treaty of Westphalia, by about 1609, we really have a separation. There's still a lot of conflicts and battles going on, but we really have a separate Protestant nation in the north, Catholic nation in the south. So what are these very industrial, successful, economically strong citizens doing? They're cultivating the idea of portraiture and showing what the people look like. We're no longer cultivating a class of aristocracy where the church and the aristocracy control art. Now we have merchants and strong economic leaders wanting their portraits done. Remember that the Dutch lived in much narrower, like canal houses in Amsterdam, for example. Some of you might have visited some of them. There's this not a need to decorate palaces and castles. Their houses are small. The paintings are smaller. And many of them still on panel, and they wanted them for their civic organizations, for their homes. And Frans Hals in the city of Haarlem was probably the most well-known portrait painter. He was actually Antwerpian. He came from Antwerp, was Flemish in origin, but he did move into the wonderful city of Haarlem. He was considered one of the best. So here we have a portrait of a man. He's wearing a little ruff, that's that intricate collar, and then a doublet, that black uniform. And he has a cape over his shoulder. What is very remarkable, and which is very commonplace in the Dutch Baroque, is a more gestural style of painting. You do see hyper detail right here in the ruff. You see a little more detail on the embellishments of the doublet. But look, the hands are very gestural. Even his skin tones and his facial characteristics, they're very real, but they're not photographically real. The interesting thing about Frans Hals, he did militia portraits, he did individual portraits. He had a very successful career in Haarlem. However, he ended up marrying like 4 different wives, some died young, and by the time he got to his last wife, she put him into some economic calamity. She was, I believe, arrested, had some indiscretions, a lot of things affected his career, even though at first he was just thriving. So eventually he died kind of sadly. Now, when this piece was taken, he was still doing very well. And this man, you can see, is 48 years old because it's signed right here and was done right here, the date 1634. And he looks confident. There's a very strong presence. Sadly about Frans Hals was after about the 17th century, he was kind of forgotten. However, some of the 19th century artists like Courbet, for example, and definitely Manet, saw some of his images and they were mesmerized by his work, his gestural brushstrokes, and began to sort of emulate them. And if you look at some of the work of Manet, some portraits, you can definitely see, sometimes you can't even tell, except for the costumes, is it Frans Hals or is it Manet? So portrait, very important, and Frans Hals was one of the greatest. I'm going to show you one more by him, and it is, by the way, the previous portrait is in the Timken collection. Now, Mali Baba, what an interesting painting. So Mali Baba kind of loosely translates into something like, crazy lady, madness, I think they had a little nickname for her, but it shows a woman with an alcohol issue. She was a woman who really did exist. Her name was Barbara, and she sort of frequented the taverns in Haarlem. They even said that one of Frans Hals' sons might have encountered her at a hospital, and saw her, but she was at a time sort of locked up in a psychiatric ward. So she is an alcoholic. She has a huge stein of beer. Look how gestural and monochromatic the palette is. It's tonalities of white, gray, brown. We don't see infusions of red or deep greens or anything like that. And many of the Dutch artists, particularly in Haarlem, if you look at some of the still life painters like Peter Claus, they did use sometimes this very beautiful monochromatic palette. So she turns away from us and looks out to maybe someone in the tavern. She leans against a table. You can kind of barely see it. Also, here's a tabletop. And then, of course, this compelling owl. What does it mean? There's a couple things that we know about owls. The wisdom of an owl, it does not apply here. This is drunk as an owl. Drunk as an owl indicates that he's watching her consume too much alcohol. She's laughing in hilarity, probably well into her multiple drinks, but he does capture the tension and the personality of this rather popular figure. So funny, I can't remember, I think it was Ghent, walking along the street, and there's a couple bars with the name Mali Baba, so it goes into both Holland and Belgium. So now we're going to move on to probably the most famous artist of the 17th century Dutch Baroque, and that is the master Rembrandt van Rijn. We have a masterful Rembrandt in the Timken, and I will show that to you in just a little while. So let's talk a few minutes about who this great painter was. Rembrandt actually was born in Leiden. His family was kind of middle class, but they saw his genius and they sent him to university in Leiden. So he was an educated man. He did eventually, when he was very young, 26, I believe, he settled in Amsterdam, where he had a very busy studio and he had many commissions. So he could paint portraits, historical paintings, religious paintings, landscape paintings, still life paintings, anything. He was a very prolific artist. Hundreds of self-portraits, for example, just like Vincent van Gogh, one of his countrymen. He did etchings, drawings. He was a book collector, an art collector. Today, you can go to Amsterdam and visit his home. Sadly, that home at one time during his bankruptcy was actually taken from him, his family, but it was bought by the city, I believe, at the turn of the 20th century, and now is established as a museum. But you can go in and see this beautiful home because even though he was pretty middle class, he married a wealthy woman, Saskia. She came from a wealthy family, and she set him up in Amsterdam in this beautiful home. So we'll talk about this early group portrait. This is considered one of the most important portraits ever done, group portraits in 17th century painting. Let's talk about its remarkable attributes. This is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulip, and he was an anatomist. And remember, science is very developed at this time. You know, when we look at the work of Jan Vermeer, I'm going to show you the influence of van Leeuwenhoek, the developer of the microscope, in his repertoire. One thing I do want to mention too is technology has such an important inspiration or involvement in the 17th century. Why? Because if I look back at the 1440s, that's the 15th century, with the advent of the printing press by Gutenberg, the dissemination of information begins to occur very broadly. That's part of the reason why John Calvin and Martin Luther and all these Protestant theologians were able to spread the gospel because they could do pamphlets. And just like the development of the microscope or the camera obscura, camera lucida, we see that the Dutch were very scientifically and technologically advanced. Medicine is evolving and surgeons are learning about anatomy. I mean, of course, they were learning about anatomy earlier on, but this is more developed. What we have is a very Baroque painting in that we're starting to see emotion and movement. So Dr. Nicholas Tulip is giving an anatomy lesson. But if you talk to any medical professional, you will see that there's some quirkiness about this. What is it? Well, first of all, a cadaver. And this cadaver has a sad story. He was caught as a thief and put to death. So they take these criminals who've been put to death, pardon me, and they use them as subjects for anatomies. Normally, as doctors have written about, is this would not have been done. They would have either cut the cranium open or the chest cavity. That would slow the, let's say, the deterioration of the body, in particular the limbs. So normally they don't open the limbs, but suffice to say, he's showing them the structure of the arm. The funny part about this painting is, if you look carefully, they are not looking at the anatomical structure of this criminal. They're looking at a book, anatomy book. So they're so intent. You think, oh, they're really looking at the veins and the tissue. Not really. They're looking at the anatomy book. Or in the case of this surgeon, he is looking at the anatomist. So that's a little sort of interesting dynamic here. One of the surgeon holds a list, probably an anatomy page or a list, and they're looking to match up perhaps, but they're really kind of looking book to book and then to the face of their teacher. Look at the range of emotion. Each face is unique. They have those Van Dyke beards, and they're using that sort of typical post-Regency costume. They're in an arched room, and this painting would have been put in the surgeon's guild or something like that. So it wasn't just for a personal, it was for the guild. But look at the light. This is chiaroscuro at its finest. So I do want to tell you a couple about 3 light sources we've discussed in other paintings, but chiaroscuro is using light to bring out dimensionality. tenebrism, when you have this, a little bit of tenebrism here with white, 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 black, 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 it is more to create drama. You're not necessarily bringing out dimensionality, but you are showing high drama. And then lastly, we have a thing called sfumato. Now, sfumato you see a little bit, and I'll show you more when we look at some other paintings, but sfumato is that sort of smokiness that Leonardo used in Italian Renaissance, where you get highlighting around particularly the face. So we will go on to another absolutely amazing group portrait. Now, this one, perhaps even more than the previous painting, is one of the most essential group portraits to study in Dutch painting. So I told you that there were militias and were often painted by great artists like Frans Hals and Rembrandt. These militias would patrol around, there were 17 provinces, Dutch provinces, but they were still patrolling to try to keep the Catholic Habsburg patrols out and maintain the integrity of the Dutch Protestant landscape. And so many of these militias were formed to sort of patrol. However, the night watch is not that. I'm going to be more specific. This is a group of maybe militia, but they're not out to patrol. They're out for a shooting match. Is it a night watch? No, it is not. It actually had another name. And I hope that many of you had the opportunity to see this installation at the Timken by extremely important Dutch photographer, maybe the most important Dutch photographer, contemporary Dutch photographer, who recorded people going to the Rijks and seeing this magnificent, huge painting that documents a lot of what is going on in the 17th century in Holland and in Amsterdam. So here we have a man whose name is Frans Hals, and he is sort of the key person in this painting, and his lieutenant. The light is dark like night, but it's because the varnish in the painting deteriorated to such an extent that it gives a smoky over glazing to the painting, and it wasn't supposed to be at night. So here we have 26 militia figures, 3 children, one of them right here. She was kind of the mascot. She holds a drinking horn. We have another smaller individual who could either be a child or perhaps a dwarf. And we have animals here, and we have all manner of men. Some of them are more illuminated by this exquisite chiaroscuro, but some of them are more placed in the back. One thing artists do is to create depth, they will paint the foreground in darker tonalities and the background lighter tonalities to give an idea of recession and depth. So we have that here. And we have all manner of helmets and weaponry. We have long guns and all kinds of weapons. And so they're loading and they're getting ready. They're going to a shooting party. There's so much dynamic movement in this painting. That's one of the things that separates the Renaissance from the Baroque. In the Renaissance, we have more that sort of post-in lens, which is an architectural term, but that more classical alignment. Here we have in the Baroque a very diagonal approach. We have movement. We see a lot of movement. You feel like these men are going to just step out of the painting. The light is highlighting their actions. So it's almost like you're looking at a movie set, and you feel like you can almost see them moving forward. So considered one of the greatest masterpieces, and again, done when he was fairly young. So we're going to go on to one more painting by our great Rembrandt van Rijn. This is St. Bartholomew. This is in the Timken Museum, and it's such an important painting that we often are asked to loan it for important collections because of its beauty. Let me tell you a little story about this painting. So this is one of the 12 apostles, and he was martyred for his beliefs. He actually went into places like today's Armenia and that area, even in India, to proselytize. But he was flayed alive for his beliefs and work proselytizing. And so he holds his attribute. So attribute is a term in art when we say that someone is holding something that indicates what they do or what they've experienced. You know, when we have young people touring the Timken, I often ask them, what would, if someone were going to paint your portrait, what would it be an attribute? And some of them might say, oh, I play soccer and I might want to hold a soccer ball. Or some of the others might say, I'm interested in art and I would hold a, you know, a paintbrush or something like that. Well, here's an attribute that talks about who this person is. So here we have this beautiful chiaroscuro. Rembrandt, we don't think he never encountered Caravaggio, but he was aware of Caravaggio's work. But also he was aware of some of the Flemish painters like Jan van Eyck, for example, who also used light so successfully. But this is not photographically real. This is where the Dutch move away from the Flemish, particularly the Flemish Renaissance painters. This is a gestural painting, but we get all of the essence of this man with gestural brushstrokes. The hand, very almost, I hate to use the term rudimentary, but kind of like that, but still it captures the structure of the hand. And then we have this very, very monochromatic palette, just tonalities of grays and browns. I will tell you that this painting, even though it is a saint, does relate to a little bit of what happened to Rembrandt. So Rembrandt was, I told you, so successful. He was madly in love with his wife. She was wealthy. They had children. But his old world started to fall apart about, 5 or 6 years before this painting was done. What happened? Saskia died young, in her 30s. 3 of the 4 children had died. His youngest, Titus, did live into his 30s, but he also died pretty young, very young. But Rembrandt was lamenting the fact he'd lost his wife. He did have a housekeeper that kind of took over and helped raise the kids that, who survived, and then they died eventually. But he was kind of losing his client base. He was overspending. He had a little bit of a spending problem, love rare manuscripts and paintings. His spending was out of control. He was sad. And so in some ways, this is kind of an insightful psychological portrait of not only Rembrandt, but of course, the Saint Bartholomew. So we're going to move on. And I told you that there was sort of a hierarchy of painting. This is a military painting, still kind of at the top of the hierarchy, but eventually seascapes and landscapes and portraiture and still life and genre also were very popular. So we're going to call this a very important seascape and political painting. So who was Albert Cup? He was from Dordrecht, where this painting was done. His father was a painter. He did mostly landscapes and seascapes. He was a very important man, not only as an artist, but he was involved with politics and religious activities at the Dutch Reformed Church. He didn't go to Italy, but he was interested in the Italianate paintings that were coming back and forth. He loved the lighting he learned from some of the Italian painters. And here we have a brilliant use of lighting. So let's talk specifically about this painting, the Maas at Dordrecht. The Maas is a river, and it's a crossroads with, I'll have to look at my notes, Merwede rivers. So Merwede, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, were 2 rivers that converge. On the Maas specifically, 2 years prior to this was the depiction of the very important end of the battles with the Habsburg Empire, and officially the Treaty of Westphalia that completely bifurcates these 2 regions. Now, I said earlier, by about 40 years before this image was seen, this was actually from a real experience, Holland was rather a separate nation, but it's not to the Treaty of Westphalia that we actually have the true separation. So let's talk about what we have here. 30,000 men in these transport boats are converging to celebrate the end of the 80 Years' War. And we have spectators on the quay, and we see some of the municipal buildings and churches. We have the flag of the Dutch Republic flying. We also have a whitish flag, and we haven't really been able to determine what that represents. In this small little boat, we have the man who probably a wealthy citizen of Dordrecht, and he is he has commissioned the painting. And so he's in a little rowboat, and we see they're let's say highlighting with music and shouting and look, we've been able to separate. We're on Dutch transport ships, and we have ended this war. It's just a really, really important. So the Peace of Munster, Treaty of Westphalia, and we have a separation. Again, we talk about light. The clouds. This is on a cool morning, but it's in the summertime. We see these cumulus clouds, the birds flying, the light falls on the ships, exquisite reflection, some of the town, the country, the Moss River. Very important political seascape, really highlighting the end of the war. Speaking of seascapes, I want to talk a little bit about Ludwig Backhuizen. I actually was very lucky when we were in Brussels. There is a couple of very important Ludwig Backhuizen paintings in this Belgian museum. Backhuizen was actually German. He was a scribe. Before he was a painter, he actually did calligraphy and did engraving and work as a scribe. But he went into Amsterdam from Germany, and he became involved with some of the artists there because they did work in guilds and schools, and St. Luke's Guild and schools and groupings of artists and families of artists. So he became very interested in some of the artists he met. He rapidly gained a very successful career. People really liked him. He actually worked in London. He worked for some of the Russian dukes, some of the Italians. So he moved around, and he had a huge following. Actually worked in Tuscany for a while, but he is considered one of the masters of Dutch marine painting. So I told you a little bit about the Dutch East Indian Company and the Dutch West Indian Company, and I do want to kind of bring it up here because these are transport ships for not military per se, but for these companies that were so powerful, and they were trading all over in Japan and the Far East, trading in Poland and Germany and all over. Products. What kind of products? Oh, spices, of course, and porcelain and silver, all manner of items. And they were bringing them into Holland and using them, but they also were cultivating crops too to be shipped out to places like Poland and Germany. These three ships are about, you'll see one here, one in the back behind, and one here. And these ships, transport ships, were not in very good shape. They're going to crash on the rocks. We even see some of the sails are down, but we do have the flag of Holland. And we see that the light is mesmerizing. It's captivating. But look, you can see the waves as they're crashing against the rocks, and the boats are in such a precarious position. You feel like they're just going to roll over. And the clouds as they emerge. One thing the Dutch were very famous for is a bit of moralizing in their paintings. And what we see here, the distress, shows that, oh my God, this ship is going to collapse. But there's also this moralizing, this idea of hope. And the hope is springing forth in this light that comes from the sky, sort of metaphorical from the heavens. And so we think of this painting as kind of all is not lost. So there is a little bit of an upbeat characteristic to Backhuizen's painting. We're going to go now to the great Jacob van Ruisdael. Jacob van Ruisdael, his uncle was Solomon van Ruisdael. He also came from a family of painters, and he was one of the greatest landscape painters. And he, like Frans Hals, settled in Haarlem. He was from a family that were actually, they were Mennonites, but he became Protestant, but he was originally a Mennonite. And they also think that he might have been a medical doctor as well. So he settled in Haarlem, and he painted incredible landscapes. So this is the Jewish cemetery. During the time of the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, we see a lot of religious groups actually leaving the Habsburg-controlled areas and going into Holland. And that would be very true of the Jewish community, and particularly the Portuguese Jewish community were coming from other places. So the Dutch were a little more open to other groups. And so we have a Jewish cemetery. Here we also have the ruins of an abbey. and Egmond Abbey, and then we also have a church. We have 3 sarcophagi right here, and then we have worshipers here. We have some marble slabs with writing. We have water that flows in this black sarcophagus, a broken tree limb, beautiful vegetation and shade trees, shattered wood, and then the light, this scrim of a rainbow. It's a magical painting, but it also talks sort of about mortality. And the Dutch, as I said, were moralizing, and you see that in the still life when we point those out, that life is ephemeral. There is hope in the world, but there is also death. This is from our own Timken collection. Van Ruisdael did 15 examples of the Haarlem bleaching fields. This in particular is a very horizontal depiction, and you can visit at the Timken. We have a low horizon line, very typical of Van Ruisdael, and we have St. Bavels. St. Bavels is a 2-spired church. St. Bavels was a Catholic church, but eventually it became a Protestant church in Haarlem, and then there's a St. Bavels in other places. There's still a Catholic church, of course, with the Ghent altarpieces in Ghent, Belgium. These are bleaching fields. Linen was a big industry. Peat, linen, boat building, currency exchange. They had the first, I forgot to mention that with the Dutch East Indian Trading Company and the West Indian Trading Company, that was the first multinational company. They had banking, they had commodities futures. We're going to talk about that when we look at tulips. So linen was a really big industry, and we have people working in the field, very small linen strips. We have some dunes here. We have the village, and this was very much what Haarlem even looks like today. So if you visit it, you might say, wow, that kind of looks like it was in yesteryear. So we're going to talk a little bit about Peter de Hoek. Some of Peter de Hoek's work, he worked in Delft, and he was a contemporary of Johannes Vermeer. You can see a lot of Vermeer's ideas in his painting. I would say he was very famous for his genre paintings, but unlike Vermeer, he was more interested, not so much capturing the sociological context of these paintings, but more how light fell on the figure and how he could develop 3-dimensionality. So it's more, and color. So it's more about painting strategies than so much evaluating the people that he's looking at. So he was in the Delft Guild of St. Luke's. He knew, as I said, Vermeer. He worked in Rotterdam, Delft, and Amsterdam. He was probably interested in the great student of Rembrandt, Carl Fabrides, who died very young in an explosion at 32. Who knows what would have happened if he had been able to live, because he was such a brilliant painter. But anyway, for a point of time, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about this painting and less about the artist. So Peter de Hoek shows a woman carefully with her daughter. And de Hoek, unlike Vermeer, had family groupings often. Vermeer usually did 1 or 2 figures. The light is an important source. Vermeer was a master of light, as was de Hoek. Light is pouring in from this one window. We see that this is more of an upper middle class home. We have a Cupid bas relief right here. We have a beautiful, intricate fireplace with a warm hearth. This is a happy family. How do we know? Because of the Cupid. Also, these are wealthier people, and so they have more access to everything. The little girl is holding a beautiful apple, and the mother is peeling for her. She pulls a little snake, like carefully, sort of like a Escher sort of unveiling. We have a little footstool. We have light as it falls on the folds of her knee. An intricate floor. So a very touching portrait of a family. But we also have other people who are doing some interesting things. And we're going to look at Vermeer's work in just a second, but I do want to point out Gerard van Hothenhorst. Hothenhorst was sort of the segue between Flemish and Dutch painting. He was from Utrecht, Holland, but he did work a lot with Flemish painting. He was interested in it. But he also was part of the movement in Utrecht of these artists, Caravaggisti. Caravaggisti were artists who either saw the work of Caravaggio and incorporated it in some of the work, or maybe even if they didn't see the work of Caravaggio in Italy, there was a lot of back and forth. Because remember, there's this huge book printing going on at this time, and even earlier. I was lucky to visit for the second time the Plantis Moritas Museum in the 16th century, which was a major printing house. So books were going back and forth, pamphlets were going back and forth, prints were going back and forth. So they were able to see some of this work. This is the Mary Fiddler. This is very Flemish, really. Why? Because the Flemish did a little bit more, I would say, vivid color than the Dutch, perhaps, a little more subdued palette. This is very much Baroque. It's on the diagonal. Remember, Baroque art, as I mentioned, very dramatic. It's on the diagonal, and it has a lot of movement, this painting. He's proffering a glass of alcohol. He's in a jovial mood. He wants us to join him. He pulls back that beautiful tapestry, and he holds a musical instrument, a violin, and he said, "Come on, join us." And he's in this very exquisite costume, and he sort of busts out of the picture frame. There's a lot of trompe l'oeil in this too. So because of time, we're going to go on. We can't miss the work of Vermeer. So let's look at Johannes Vermeer. This is the Laughing Girl. So Johannes Vermeer was born 2 years after von Leeuwenhoek. And I actually had the opportunity at the Timken to talk to the wonderful Arthur Wheelock, who's probably the most important Dutch expert. And he said that, yes, some people debate whether Van Leeuwenhoek and Vermeer interacted with each other, Van Leeuwenhoek, having developed the microscope. And it's pretty obvious that they did. Actually, when Vermeer died young, his wife had I think 8 or 11 children. She was going into bankruptcy, and it was Van Leeuwenhoek who bought the estate from the Vermeer family. There are only, I believe, 35 Vermeer extant in the world. 29 were assembled at the Rijksmuseum about a year ago. But we'll move on. So Jan Vermeer probably used camera obscura. That's an optical device because of the hyperrealism in this painting. He was influenced by also Carl Fabritas, and he settled in Delft. He married a Catholic. He was Protestant, and he converted, and he lived in what's called the Papist section of Delft. That means they sort of pushed the Catholics into one region because it's now Protestant. In this painting, we see an officer who is either interacting with this woman in a banal way or maybe even a transactional way, if you get my drift. Maybe she is not a regular housewife. Maybe she is a prostitute. We don't know. This is a map. Vermeer was very interested in maps, and with all the trading going on, that also interested him. Look at the light source. Look at the rich color. He often used aquamarine that came from Afghanistan. One of his clients provided that, and he uses that deep, rich color. I'm going to move on because I am running out of time, as I usually do. I go too slowly, and then we run out of time. So the artist in his studio. This has many different, connotations, and sometimes it's called the artist in a studio, or was an allegory of painting. So we have the muse of history from Greek mythology, Clio. She holds a history book and a musical instrument, and we see this exquisite map. Now, unfortunately, this particular image is missing the great chandelier with the Habsburg emblem on the top. So I do apologize. This one somehow got cut off. As I say, I apologize. So the artist, very well dressed, is using this aquamarine blue that he might have got, the lapis blue. And Cleo turns and she holds the instrument, and you see his careful depiction of the detail in this very fancy costume. But we do have to look at this. If you want to see how Vermeer uses light in this portrait of Delft, there are only 3 cityscapes or landscapes, as it were, that were known to be done by Johannes Vermeer, Jan Vermeer, but only 2 survive, and this is one of them. This happens to be my favorite, and it's a view of his city of Delft, and it's taken from a 3rd-story window, and he's painting it, and he looks down and he sees the magnificent, it's just exquisite light that it falls on the water and the buildings, and we have the new kirk and the old church, the new old church, new church, and then we have the Parrot brewing company that no longer exists, but that was destroyed. And then we have boats, and we have people on the quay, and it's just a beautiful summer day in Delft, and just a very, very remarkable depiction of the city of Delft. Now we're going to get into still life painting. I do want to talk about a couple things with still life painting. The Dutch were interested in the idea of vanitas, the vanity of life and death, and using memento mori, objects that express the idea that life is ephemeral. And even in the Van Ruisdael that we looked at the very beginning of the talk, when we see those clouds in the sky, I should have pointed out then, but what he's suggesting is life is ephemeral, things can change momentarily. So don't get too, let's say, boisterous and proud, because things can change. So this very own Peter Klaus is in the Timken, and it shows a breakfast scene and also a smoker's requisite. Here we have smoking implements, tobacco, and then we have a Venetian glass. After 1650, when there was even more trade and commerce, we have even more luxurious elements in the still life painting. But here, this is a little bit more basic. This is maybe a less wealthy owner, but he has Venetian glass, beer, half full, life ends, burning embers, and dying fish. A typical breakfast, because beer would have been consumed as opposed to water, was very contaminated at this time. We have the pewter, the overturned earthenware jug, and then these fish beautifully cantilevered over a sort of a basic table, almost like cement. I have to show you, though, the work of a couple more still life painters, Willem Kalf, who actually worked a lot in France. He worked with a group of Dutch artists who gravitated to the beautiful Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, and he was very captivated by the goods that were coming into porcelain, the Chinese goods, the Wan Li porcelain from the Ming Dynasty, these Venetian glasses, pocket watch, oranges and lemons that came from Spain, for example. So he's showing off the riches of a wealthier Dutch family. We have the tapestry, as I said, the silver is kind of at an angle, and then we have a moralizing element, a memento mori, the moralizing of life, and the end of life comes to all of us. So I'm going to move on really quickly. John David Stahiem, oh my God, he was from a Catholic family, sort of Flemish influence. He did belong to the Guild of St. Luke. He worked primarily between Utrecht and Antwerp. This is remarkable. Again, this is a little bit higher status home. Look at the jewel-like seeds of the pomegranate. We have an overturned romer. A romer is a glass goblet that would have edges on it, so if you picked it up, you wouldn't shatter it. We have lemons from Spain, the bubbles, the beautiful champagne bubbles, the ephemeral nature of life, and then, of course, temperance, turned over glass, and oysters. Oysters, sometimes, the bounty of the sea because of the accessibility to the sea with the Dutch and the Flemish, but also a little bit of sensuality. Now, I have to talk. I know we only have a couple more minutes, and I'm sorry I sometimes go over. If you will allow me to go to 12, and then we'll have any questions afterward. There's something that really interestingly happens in Holland at this time. It's from 1634 to 1636 or 7, and it's called tulipomania. Well, we call it tulipomania now. What was tulipomania? And it's brought out by Ambrosius Bosschaert. He was Dutch and Flemish too. And tulips were actually from the Ottoman Empire. They came from the steppes of Russia. They went into the Ottoman Empire, and they named them tulips from the word turban. The Dutch in the trading fell in love with these tulip bulbs. So in 1634, they developed a commodities interest. What was the commodity? Tulip bulbs. They became so prized that this is literally true, and it's brought up in the book, and it's by Mike Dash. It was published 25 years ago. I highly recommend it. It talks about how the commodities of tulips became so out of control that people were literally trading a canal house for 4 tulip bulbs. And they prized the ones that had been affected by blight. You can see that in these variegated tulips, all manner of color and beauty. And he puts them in a little Wan Li porcelain. Wan Li porcelain comes from the Ming Dynasty. And then, of course, the snails and bugs have a quality of things like redemption and other messages. But we really are focusing on the tulip. By 1636 or 37, the Dutch government outlawed this kind of tulip mania because it was starting to affect the whole economy. now Balthasar van der Ast, he was also a Flemish Dutch, and he in this painting shows the bounty of nature. And he brings in all manner of flower, tulips and ranunculus, carnations. They probably all weren't growing at the same time. What these artists did is saw these flowers, sketched them out, brought them together in this woven basket. And then we have everything. He loved to paint seashells and the light as it falls on the grapes and the cherries. So a lot of beauty in this. So quickly, Willem Klaus Hede, who was a contemporary of Peter Klaus in Haarlem. This is a little more aristocratic in terms of the silver, the overturned nautilus shell, the beautiful pie. You just want to dive into that black currant pie, and the champagne glass and the spiral lemon and the beautiful light as it falls on this roamer. Totally monochromatic and very elegant in that state. So the last artist I'm going to talk about just for 1 minute, I'm so sorry to give short shrift to Gabriel Matsu. This is again a Timken painting. This was featured, it is not part of our collection, the collection of the museum, but it also was part of a really wonderful exhibition. Many of the paintings came from the Leiden Foundation. And this painting shows the importance of how the Dutch in the 17th century developed a postal system, and also letter writing was really important, and it shows that. So a letter is delivered to a woman. She's seated in a beautiful arcade. There's a Palladian, the great Renaissance Venetian architect, Palladio, and we have flowers that represent true love, and a messenger is handing her a letter. Now, there is a companion painting, not in the Timken, which we think relates to this painting. It's a man receiving her letter. This tells a story. This is a very, like a narrative, and you see his skill at painting. Sadly, this artist, Metsu, did die very young. And last painting, I just want to show you, and then we're just about at 12, another Metsu called The Sick Child. And this is in the Rijks. If you look at this, it's a very tragic painting. Remember, even when we look back at our Sienese masterpieces in the Timken, we know that the plague was decimating citizens throughout hundreds of years. It didn't stop in the 14th century. It didn't stop in the 15th century. It went on. And in the 16th century, about 1 in every 10 people died of plague around this time in the city of Amsterdam. So we have a sick child, but he was a Catholic, and he really paints what seems to be the Madonna and child being held, and the child, we don't know if the child survives. There is a cross somewhere in this painting. I can't, crucifixion, sorry, right here. And it's a very Catholic theme of motherhood and wellness and such. So you can visit this in the Rijksmuseum. So I'm right at 12 o'clock. If there are any questions, I would be happy to, if anybody sticks around and wants to hear the answer or has any comments, we'd be happy to address them. Hi, Renata.
Hello. Yes, so I got a question from Jane LaFazio. Is that group on the shore, Jesus and his followers? It was one of the first paintings
Yes,
that,
it is. Absolutely. That is Peter Bruegel, and that is Jesus proselytizing. I'm going to go back because I think it's important to look at the painting when we talk about it. Yes, absolutely. Good call. So here's the farmer. What we sow, you shall reap, plant crops, but also here's Jesus right in the center of that. I don't know if my cursor is effective right now, but you can see this group of people on the background, and that's Jesus within the group of people, and he is proselytizing. Yes, very good call.
And then a comment from Facebook is, I'm a huge fan of Pieter de Hooch and luckily saw an exhibition in the 90s.
Oh, where was the exhibition?
They don't say.
Oh, yeah,
Maybe.
I love his work. And also they were both influenced by Carl Fabritas. And one thing, I don't know if I mentioned this, that sometimes in the beginning of this, well, sort of the exploration of this period, they thought that a lot of Hook's paintings were actually Vermeer's. Perhaps Vermeer's slightly a finer brushstroke. That's debatable. If you might not think that, but I would have loved to have seen that because I do admire his work greatly.
And lastly, from Giselle Page, fantastic presentation. Thank you. I'm excited to be in Amsterdam in 2 weeks.
Oh my goodness, you're so smart. Oh, well, I'm sorry. Good to get a little background when you go. And I want to just recommend three museums that maybe you've been many times, but of course the Rijks, of course the Van Gogh, but the Stedelijk, if you are interested in contemporary art and design, which is right next to those museums in the museum park, the Stedelijk is an often overlooked museum. So if you have time, that might be a great place to look at contemporary European design and art.
She says, thank you very much for recommendation. She also put the Frans Hals exhibit at the NG London was incredible.
Oh, oh, Frans Hals. And then in if you're in Amsterdam, go to Haarlem, which is only 45-minute train ride, and the Frans Hal Museum is stellar. You probably know that, but that's a great museum to revisit or visit. Um,
And
good.
that was the last comment that we have. So
Oh, great. Well, thank you all for attending. As I apologize for being a little slow today. I'm still getting over jet lag from my Flemish trip, but hopefully we got to see some great works of art today. But thank you all for being in attendance, and thank you, Renata.
yes, thank you for being here. Oh, from Uno Mom. As usual, fantastic presentation. I especially enjoy the Rembrandts, also ships in distress. I appreciate the historical background and details. The Jan Vermeer view of Delft just takes my breath away.
100% agree. 100. And the three paintings you pointed out were some of the most. And looking at Bakhuyzen's work at the in Brussels, it is so dynamic. I mean, you just feel the boats tumbling into the sea. But thank you for that comment.
Christina says, thank you.
Okay.
And before you all go, I would like to remind you that this tour and other tours put on previously through the Timken Museum can be found on our Facebook page. If you would like to find further information on any future tours being put on by the Timken Museum, please check out our website event calendar for those details. Thank you again for joining us this morning, and thank you, Docent Halmerson, for a wonderful presentation. Goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Recording.